It was a quiet Tuesday evening in the small town of Maplewood. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and purple across the sky. A gentle breeze swept through the streets, rustling leaves and cooling the air, after a warm day. Most people were indoors now, settling into their routines, cooking dinner, watching TV, or tucking their kids into bed. But on one porch near the edge of town, an elderly man named Henry Jackson sat alone, enjoying the calmness of the night. Henry was no stranger to this neighborhood. He had lived there for over 40 years, long before the houses around him were built. Back then, it was mostly open fields and dirt roads. Over time, the area transformed into a suburban community filled with families, schools, and parks. Henry loved his home. It held memories of his wife, who had passed away 10 years ago, and his children, who had grown up and moved away. Now, at 78 years old, he spent most evenings sitting on his porch, sipping lemonade and reflecting on life. Tonight, however, would be different. As Henry rocked back and forth in his creaky wooden chair, 2 police cars rolled down the street. Their red and blue lights flashed silently, casting eerie shadows on nearby houses. Inside the first car were officers Chris Miller and Ryan Bates. Both men were relatively new to the force, having joined only a few years earlier. They weren't bad guys per se. They simply believed they were doing what was expected of them. Unfortunately, that belief came wrapped in layers of ignorance and prejudice. The officers had received a vague call about suspicious activity in the area. No specifics were given, just a tip from an anonymous caller. Without much to go, on they decided to patrol the streets and see if anything stood out. When they reached Henry's house, they slowed down. There on the porch sat an elderly black man rocking gently in his chair. To most people, this scene wouldn't raise any alarms, but for Chris and Ryan, it did. "Looks like we've got someone here," Chris said, nodding toward Henry. His tone carried a hint of suspicion, as though seeing an older black man sitting on his own porch was somehow unusual. Ryan nodded in agreement. "Yeah, let's check it out." They parked their car across the street and stepped out, their boots crunching against the pavement. As they approached Henry's driveway, neither officer bothered to introduce themselves properly. Instead, Chris called out sharply, "Hey, what are you doing here?" Henry looked up, startled by the sudden intrusion. For a moment he didn't respond, unsure why these men were addressing him so rudely. Then, recognizing their uniforms, he replied calmly, "I'm sitting on my porch. This is my house." Chris frowned, clearly unimpressed by Henry's answer. "Your house?" he repeated skeptically. "You sure about that?" "Yes, I'm sure," Henry said, his voice steady despite the tension building inside him. He gestured toward the mailbox at the end of his driveway, where his last name was clearly visible. "See, my name's right there." Ryan glanced at the mailbox, then exchanged a look with Chris. Neither seemed convinced. "All right, fine," Chris said gruffly. "But what are you doing out here so late? People don't just sit outside for no reason." Henry sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He had lived in this neighborhood longer than either of these men had been alive, yet they questioned whether he belonged here. Still, he kept his composure. "I'm retired," he explained patiently. "I like sitting on my porch sometimes. It helps me relax." Chris smirked, shaking his head. "Relax? At your age, shouldn't you be inside resting or something?" Henry ignored the jab, choosing instead to focus on remaining polite. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself," he said firmly. "Now, unless you have a good reason for disturbing me, I'd appreciate it if you left me alone." For a brief moment, it seemed like the officers might walk away, but then Ryan spoke up, his tone laced with mockery. "You hear that, Chris? He wants us to leave him alone." He chuckled, glancing at his partner. "Guess we should listen to the expert." Chris joined in the laughter, clearly amused by his colleague's comment. Together they began circling Henry's porch, inspecting it as though searching for evidence of wrongdoing. They peered into windows, examined flower pots, and even kicked at the base of the steps leading up to the door. All the while, Henry watched them silently, his jaw tightening with each passing second. Finally, unable to contain his irritation any longer, he spoke again. "What exactly are you looking for?" he demanded. "I told you this is my house. If you have a warrant or some kind of official business, show it to me. Otherwise, stop wasting my time." Chris stopped mid-step and turned to face Henry, his expression hardening. "Listen, old man," he snapped. "We're just trying to do our jobs. Maybe if you acted less suspicious, we wouldn't have to bother you." "Suspicious?" Henry echoed incredulously. "How am I being suspicious? I'm sitting on my own property, minding my own business. You're the ones causing trouble." Before Chris could respond, Ryan interjected with a sneer. "Oh, come on. Don't play innocent with us. We get calls about this place all the time. People saying strange things happen here." "That's a lie," Henry shot back, his patience wearing thin. "Nobody's complained about me because I haven't done anything wrong. Why don't you ask around? My neighbors know me. They'll tell you I'm harmless." Chris crossed his arms, clearly annoyed. "Maybe we will," he said coldly. "Or maybe we'll handle this ourselves." With that, he signaled to Ryan, and together they walked around to the side of the house. Moments later, they returned, dragging a garden hose. Henry's eyes widened in disbelief as they hooked it up to the outdoor faucet and turned it on full blast. Water surged through the hose, spraying wildly in every direction. "What are you doing?" Henry shouted, rising from his chair. "Stop that!" Ignoring his protests, Chris aimed the hose directly at Henry, drenching him in icy water. Ryan doubled over with laughter, clutching his stomach as though it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. Henry stumbled backward, shielding his face with his arms, but the relentless stream of water knocked him off balance. He fell onto the wet wooden planks of the porch, gasping for breath. "You wanted to stay outside, huh?" Chris taunted, keeping the hose trained on him. "Well, enjoy your bath." Neighbors peeked through their curtains, witnessing the horrifying scene unfold. Some looked away, too afraid to intervene. Others whispered among themselves, wondering if they should call for help. But no one dared step outside, not while those officers were still there, wielding their authority like a weapon. After what felt like an eternity, Chris finally turned off the hose and tossed it aside. He and Ryan exchanged smug grins, patting each other on the back as though they'd accomplished something impressive. Then, without so much as an apology, they climbed back into their patrol car and drove off, leaving Henry soaked and shivering on the porch. For several minutes, Henry sat there in stunned silence, his clothes clinging to his frail body. The warmth of the evening had vanished, replaced by a chilling sense of betrayal. How could anyone treat another human being this way? And why? Just because of the color of his skin? Eventually, he managed to pull himself to his feet and stagger inside. Once there, he stripped off his wet clothes and wrapped himself in a blanket, trembling not just from the cold but from anger and humiliation. As he sat alone in the dim light of his living room, tears streaming down his cheeks, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of world this had become. One where people like him were treated as less than human. Little did Henry know, his son, Marcus, would soon return to town, and when he learned about what happened, the entire community would feel the ripple effects of his rage and his resolve. Marcus Jackson had not set foot in Maplewood for nearly 5 years. Life had taken him far away from the quiet town where he grew up, pulling him into a world of big city challenges and relentless advocacy. Now a civil rights lawyer based in Chicago, Marcus spent his days fighting against systemic racism and injustice. His work was demanding, often exhausting, but it gave him purpose, a way to honor the struggles of those who came before him, including his father, Henry. When Marcus's phone rang late on Wednesday night, he didn't recognize the number. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something told him to answer. On the other end of the line was his younger sister, Angela. Her voice trembled as she spoke, each word heavy with emotion. "Marcus," she said, barely holding back tears, "you need to come home. Something happened to Dad." At first, Marcus thought it might be a health issue. Henry was getting older, after all, and while he was still active and sharp-minded, no one could escape the realities of aging forever. But as Angela began recounting the events of the previous evening, the officers showing up at their father's house, accusing him of loitering, soaking him with a hose, Marcus felt a cold rage building inside him. By the time Angela finished speaking, his hands were clenched into fists and his jaw was tight. "I'll be there tomorrow," Marcus said firmly. There was no hesitation in his voice. This wasn't just about family. It was about standing up for what was right. Someone needed to hold these officers accountable, and if no one else would do it, Marcus would. The next morning, Marcus boarded the first flight to Maplewood. As the plane soared above the clouds, he stared out the window, replaying Angela's words in his mind. The image of his father sitting drenched and humiliated on his own porch made Marcus's chest ache with anger and sadness. How could anyone treat another human being that way? And why did such blatant acts of prejudice continue to happen even in this day and age? By noon, Marcus arrived at the small airport near Maplewood. Angela was waiting for him outside baggage claim, her face pale but determined. Without saying a word, she hugged him tightly as though drawing strength from his presence. They drove straight to their father's house, neither speaking much during the ride. The closer they got, the more Marcus noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Newer houses stood alongside older ones, some well-maintained, others showing signs of neglect. It was clear that tensions had been simmering beneath the surface for a long time. When they pulled into Henry's driveway, Marcus saw his father sitting on the porch again, wrapped in a thick blanket despite the warm afternoon sun. Henry looked smaller somehow, frailer than Marcus remembered. For a moment, guilt washed over him. He hadn't visited in so long, and now here he was, arriving only because of tragedy. "Dad?" Marcus called softly as he approached the porch. Henry turned his head slowly, his expression lighting up when he saw his son. Despite everything, he managed a weak smile. "Marcus," Henry said, his voice gravelly but warm. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Yes, I did," Marcus replied, kneeling beside his father. He reached out and placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Angela told me what happened. Are you okay?" Henry nodded, though his eyes betrayed the pain he carried. "I'm fine, son. Just tired. It's not the first time people have treated me poorly because of my skin color, but I never expected it to happen here, in my own neighborhood." Marcus listened quietly, letting his father speak. When Henry finished, Marcus took a deep breath. "We're going to fix this," he said firmly. "Those officers crossed a line and they can't get away with it." Henry sighed, shaking his head. "I don't know, Marcus. These things rarely change. Even if we try, they'll just find a way to protect each other." "Maybe," Marcus admitted. "But we owe it to ourselves, and to everyone else who's been treated unfairly, to at least try. If nothing else, maybe we can make them think twice before doing something like this again." Henry studied his son for a moment, seeing the fire in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "All right, Marcus. Do what you need to do. Just promise me you won't let this eat you alive." "I promise," Marcus said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. Deep down, he knew how hard it would be to take on the system, but giving up wasn't an option. Later that evening, Marcus met with Angela in the kitchen to strategize. She had already gathered some information, jotting down notes about the incident and listing names of neighbors who might be willing to testify. "A few people saw what happened," Angela explained. "Some are scared to talk, but others want to help. A woman named Lisa Carter lives 2 doors down, and she recorded part of it on her phone." "That's good," Marcus said, nodding. "Every little bit helps. Tomorrow, I'll visit the police station and file a formal complaint. After that, we'll see where things stand." Angela hesitated, biting her lip. "Do you think they'll listen to you? You know how these departments operate. They stick together no matter what." "I know," Marcus said grimly, "but I also know how to push back. Trust me, Angela. We'll figure this out." The following morning, Marcus headed to the Maplewood Police Department. The building was unassuming, a single-story brick structure with a faded sign out front. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Marcus approached the front desk where a young receptionist sat typing on a computer. She glanced up briefly before returning her focus to the screen. "I'd like to speak with Chief Daniels," Marcus said politely. "It's regarding an incident involving officers Chris Miller and Ryan Bates." The receptionist frowned, clearly uncomfortable. Do you have an appointment? No, Marcus replied. But I'm sure the chief will want to hear what I have to say. After a brief pause, the receptionist picked up the phone and relayed Marcus's request. A few minutes later, a tall man with graying hair emerged from a nearby office. This was Chief Daniels, a career officer with decades of experience under his belt. He greeted Marcus with a firm handshake, his demeanor professional but guarded. What brings you here, Mr. Jackson? Chief Daniels asked, motioning for Marcus to follow him into his office. Once seated, Marcus laid out the details of the incident, emphasizing the unnecessary aggression displayed by the officers. He mentioned the garden hose, the mocking tone, and the lack of justification for their actions. Throughout the conversation, Chief Daniels listened attentively, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. When Marcus finished, the chief leaned, back in his chair, exhaling slowly. I understand your concerns, Chief Daniels said carefully, but I assure you, our officers are trained to handle situations professionally. If there was misconduct, rest assured it will be addressed. Marcus raised an eyebrow, skeptical of the chief's vague assurance. With all due respect, sir, I've heard that line too many times. What exactly does addressed mean? Will there be an investigation? Consequences for the officers involved? Chief Daniels shifted slightly in his seat, clearly uneasy. There will be an internal review, he said. However, I must remind you that policing is a difficult job. Sometimes decisions are made in the heat of the moment. So you're saying my father deserved to be humiliated because your officers were having a tough day? Marcus shot back, his voice rising slightly. No, that's not what I'm saying, Chief Daniels replied, his tone firmer now. But we have to consider context. Your father may not have realized how his presence appeared suspicious to the officers. Marcus stared at the chief, incredulous. Suspicious? He was sitting on his own porch minding his business. Are you telling me that's grounds for harassment? Chief Daniels sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, Mr. Jackson, I sympathize with your situation, but accusing officers without evidence isn't productive. Let us handle this internally. Frustrated but unwilling to escalate the confrontation further, Marcus stood up. Fine, he said curtly. Handle it internally. But know this, I won't stop until justice is served. If your department refuses to act, I'll take this to the media, the courts, and anyone else who will listen. Without waiting for a response, Marcus turned and left the office. As he stepped outside, the weight of the challenge ahead settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew Chief Daniels wouldn't budge easily, but that didn't matter. Marcus had faced obstacles like this before, and he wasn't about to give up now, not when his father's dignity was on the line. Over the next few days, Marcus threw himself into gathering evidence. He visited neighbors, encouraging them to share their stories. Some were hesitant, fearful of retaliation, but others agreed to cooperate. Lisa Carter proved particularly helpful, providing video footage that captured part of the incident. With each piece of evidence, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. No matter how daunting the fight seemed, he refused to back down. And somewhere deep inside, he knew his father was watching, not just to see if Marcus could win, but to see if he could inspire change. As Marcus Jackson continued his investigation, tensions in Maplewood began to rise. The small town, once known for its quiet charm and friendly neighbors, now felt like a powder keg ready to explode. People whispered about the incident involving Henry Jackson and the officers, their opinions divided. Some supported Marcus's efforts to seek justice, while others dismissed the whole situation as an overreaction. The divide was clear, and it grew wider with each passing day. Marcus spent hours walking through the neighborhood, knocking on doors and speaking with residents. He knew how important it was to gather testimonies from people who had witnessed the incident firsthand. Many were hesitant at first, afraid of drawing attention to themselves or angering the police. But Marcus had a way of putting people at ease. His calm demeanor and unwavering determination inspired trust, and slowly people began to open up. One afternoon, Marcus visited Lisa Carter, the young woman who had recorded part of the incident on her phone. She lived 2 houses down from Henry, close enough to see everything clearly but far enough to avoid being noticed by the officers. When Marcus arrived, Lisa greeted him nervously, clutching her phone tightly as though it held secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to share. "Thank you for agreeing to talk," Marcus said warmly, taking a seat at her kitchen table. "I know, this isn't easy." Lisa nodded, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "It's not that I don't want to help," she explained. I don't know what might happen if I get involved. My boyfriend thinks I should stay out of it." "I understand your concerns," Marcus replied gently. "But if we don't speak up, nothing will change. What those officers did to my father was wrong, and they need to be held accountable. Your video could make all the difference." After a long pause, Lisa sighed and handed over her phone. "Here," she said quietly. "You can have it. Just, please don't tell anyone where it came from. At least not yet." Marcus smiled, reassuringly. "Your name won't come up unless you're comfortable with it, I promise." With Lisa's footage in hand, Marcus felt a renewed sense of hope. The video showed officers Chris Miller and Ryan Bates drenching Henry with the hose, their laughter echoing in the background. It was damning evidence, proof that the officers hadn't acted out of necessity but out of cruelty. But Marcus also knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough. He needed more voices, more stories to build a case strong enough to withstand resistance. Meanwhile, news of Marcus's efforts spread quickly around town. Conversations buzzed in grocery stores, coffee shops, and school parking lots. Some residents admired Marcus's courage, calling him a hero for standing up against injustice. Others, however, saw him as a troublemaker stirring up unnecessary drama. Among them were Officer Miller and Officer Bates, who grew increasingly defensive as word of Marcus's investigation reached their ears. At the police station, the two officers sat together during a break, venting their frustrations to anyone who would listen. "Can you believe this guy?" Chris muttered bitterly, slamming his fist on the table. "He shows up out of nowhere, accusing us of God knows what, and suddenly everyone's acting like we're criminals." Ryan nodded in agreement, his face red with anger. "Yeah, and what about all the times we've done our jobs right? Does anyone care about that?" "No, of course not. They only focus on this one thing because it fits their narrative." Their colleagues offered sympathetic nods, reinforcing the officers' belief that they were being unfairly targeted. Chief Daniels tried to mediate, reminding them to stay professional, but even he struggled to maintain control. The department was under scrutiny, and the pressure was mounting. The tension spilled over into public spaces. One evening, Marcus stopped by a local diner to grab dinner. As he waited for his order, he overheard a group of men at a nearby table talking loudly about the incident. Their tone was dismissive, almost mocking. "Come on," one of them said, shaking his head. "An old man sitting on his porch? That's suspicious. You can't blame the cops for checking it out." Another man chimed in, laughing. "Yeah, and look at his son, running back here like some big-shot lawyer. Probably just looking for attention." Marcus clenched his fists under the table, forcing himself to stay calm. He wanted to confront them, to demand they explain why they thought it was acceptable to mistreat someone simply because of their race. But he knew better than to engage. Instead, he paid for his meal and left without saying a word, vowing to channel his anger into action rather than argument. Despite the backlash, Marcus found allies in unexpected places. A retired teacher named Margaret Ellis approached him after seeing him speak with Lisa. She introduced herself shyly, explaining that she had lived next door to Henry for years and considered him a dear friend. "I saw what happened," she admitted softly, "and I couldn't sleep thinking about it. If you need someone to testify, I'll do it." Her words brought tears to Marcus's eyes. For every person who doubted him, there was another willing to stand beside him. Together they formed a loose coalition of supporters, neighbors, friends, and even strangers who believed in justice. They began meeting regularly at the community center, brainstorming ways to amplify their message and hold the police accountable. The turning point came when Marcus decided to organize a peaceful protest. He invited everyone who cared about the issue to join him outside the police station, holding signs and chanting slogans like "Justice for Henry" and "No more racism." Word of the event spread quickly, drawing attention from local news outlets. By the time the protest took place, dozens of people had gathered, standing shoulder to shoulder in solidarity. Henry himself attended, leaning on a cane as he walked alongside his son. Though frail, he carried himself with dignity, his presence inspiring others to keep fighting. As the crowd chanted, Henry raised a trembling hand, signaling for silence. When the noise died down, he spoke in a voice that was soft but steady. "I'm not asking for revenge," he said, addressing both the protesters and the officers watching from inside the station. "All I want is respect, for myself and for everyone else who has been treated unfairly. Please let this be a chance for us to learn and grow." His words moved many to tears, including Lisa, who stood nearby holding her sign. For the first time, she felt proud of her decision to come forward. She realized that staying silent wouldn't protect her. It would only allow injustice to continue unchecked. Back at the police station, Officers Miller and Bates watched the protest unfold from behind closed blinds. Their faces were pale, their confidence shaken. For the first time, they began to question whether their actions had truly been justified. Chief Daniels called them into his office, his expression grim. "This is getting out of hand," he said bluntly. "If we don't address this properly, it's going to blow up in our faces. I suggest you start preparing yourselves for an internal review, and maybe even disciplinary action." Chris and Ryan exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the gravity of the situation. They had always assumed their behavior would go unchallenged, protected by the shield of authority. Now, faced with the possibility of consequences, they felt exposed and vulnerable. That night, Marcus returned home exhausted but hopeful. The protest had gone better than expected, drawing widespread attention and support. Angela greeted him at the door, her face glowing with pride. "You're doing amazing work, Marcus," she said, hugging him tightly. "Dad's so proud of you." Marcus smiled faintly, though his mind was still racing. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of optimism. Change wouldn't come overnight, but with persistence and unity, anything was possible. As he lay in bed that night, Marcus thought about his father's words earlier that day. Respect, that's all anyone wanted. It seemed simple, yet it remained elusive for so many. With renewed resolve, Marcus vowed to keep pushing forward, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The days following the protest were a whirlwind of activity in Maplewood. The town, once sleepy and predictable, now buzzed with energy as people debated what had happened to Henry Jackson and what should happen next. Marcus Jackson, fueled by the momentum of the protest, threw himself into preparing for a formal complaint against Officers Chris Miller and Ryan Bates. He knew that organizing a demonstration was one thing, but taking legal action, forcing accountability through official channels, was another challenge entirely. Marcus spent hours at the local library, poring over laws and regulations related to police conduct. He drafted a detailed report outlining the officers' misconduct, including Lisa Carter's video footage, witness testimonies, and photographs of Henry soaked and shivering on his porch. Every piece of evidence was carefully organized, each word chosen with precision. Marcus wasn't just fighting for justice for his father. He was setting an example for how communities could stand up to systemic injustice. Despite his determination, Marcus couldn't ignore the growing resistance from certain parts of the town. Some residents, emboldened by fear or loyalty to the police department, began pushing back against Marcus's efforts. Flyers appeared around Maplewood, accusing Marcus of stirring up trouble and exaggerating the incident. One flyer even read, "Our officers risk their lives every day. Don't ruin them because of one misunderstanding." At first, Marcus tried to brush off these attacks. He reminded himself that change always faced opposition, especially when it challenged deeply ingrained systems of power. But when someone spray-painted "Go home" on the side of Henry's garage late one night, Marcus realized the stakes were higher than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about holding two officers accountable. It was about confronting the deep-seated prejudices that lingered beneath the surface of their community. Angela noticed the toll this fight was taking on her brother. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, and the way he snapped at minor inconveniences. One evening, after Marcus spent hours reviewing documents at the kitchen table, Angela placed a cup of tea in front of him and sat down. "You're running yourself ragged," she said gently. "You can't do everything alone, Marcus." "I'm not doing it alone," Marcus replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "People are helping. Lisa, Margaret, Dad. Everyone who showed up to the protest is behind me." "That's true," Angela admitted. "But you're carrying most of the weight. You need to let others share the burden. If you burn out, none of this matters." Her words struck a chord. Marcus knew she was right. As much as he wanted to lead the charge, he couldn't afford to neglect his own well-being, or alienate the very people he needed to support him. Reluctantly, he agreed to delegate some tasks. He asked Lisa to reach out to other neighbors who might have information, tasked Margaret with coordinating another meeting at the community center, and leaned on Angela to help draft letters to city officials. Meanwhile, tensions within the police department reached a boiling point. Officers Miller and Bates, once confident in their actions, now felt cornered. They had expected the controversy to die down quickly, dismissed as an isolated incident. Instead, it had spiraled into something much bigger, a symbol of broader issues plaguing law enforcement across the country. Chief Daniels called the two officers into his office again, his tone sharper than before. "This situation is escalating faster than I anticipated," he said bluntly. "We've got reporters sniffing around, activists breathing down our necks, and half the town questioning our integrity. You two are at the center of it, whether you like it or not." Chris shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. "Sir, we didn't mean for any of this to happen. We were just doing our job." "Doing your job?" Chief Daniels repeated incredulously. "Soaking an elderly man with a hose is part of your job description? Laughing while you humiliate him is standard procedure?" Ryan spoke up, his voice defensive. "It's not like that. People complain about suspicious activity all the time. We checked it out and things got out of hand. That's all." "That's all?" Chief Daniels echoed, slamming his palm on the desk. "Do you hear yourselves? You're making excuses instead of owning up to your mistakes. If you don't start cooperating fully with the investigation, I won't hesitate to suspend you both." The threat hung heavy in the air. For the first time, Chris and Ryan looked genuinely afraid. They left the chief's office in silence, their usual bravado replaced by unease. Though they still believed they were being unfairly targeted, they couldn't deny the mounting pressure, from their boss, from the public, and from themselves. As Marcus prepared to file his formal complaint, he decided to hold a second protest. This time, he invited speakers from neighboring towns who had experienced similar incidents of police misconduct. The goal was to broaden the conversation, showing that Maplewood wasn't unique. It was part of a larger pattern of systemic racism and abuse of power. On the morning of the event, Marcus arrived at the community center early to set up. Volunteers helped arrange chairs, hang banners, and distribute flyers. By the time the protest began, hundreds of people had gathered, filling the space with a mix of anger, hope, and determination. Among the crowd were familiar faces: Lisa, Margaret, Angela, and many new ones, united by a shared desire for change. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stepped onto a makeshift stage, gripping the microphone tightly. His voice trembled slightly at first, but as he spoke, it grew stronger. "We're here today not just for my father," he began, "but for every person who has been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. What happened to Henry Jackson wasn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a system that too often devalues Black lives. And if we want things to change, we have to demand accountability." The crowd erupted in applause, cheering loudly. Marcus paused, letting the moment sink in. Then he continued, his tone firmer now. "But demanding accountability isn't enough. We also need transparency. We need reforms. We need to create a system where officers are held responsible for their actions, not protected by empty promises or internal reviews that go nowhere. That starts with us. With you." As Marcus finished speaking, a young woman named Sarah stepped forward. She lived in a nearby town and had traveled to Maplewood specifically to attend the protest. Her story mirrored Henry's in many ways. She recounted how her teenage son had been stopped and searched by police without cause, leaving him traumatized and distrustful of authority figures. "I came here today because I'm tired of feeling powerless," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I'm tired of watching my son grow up in a world where he's seen as a threat simply because of who he is. Something has to change, and I believe it can, if we keep standing together." One by one, others took the stage, sharing their experiences and calling for justice. Each story added fuel to the fire, igniting a sense of collective purpose among the attendees. By the end of the event, there was no doubt that the movement had grown beyond Maplewood. It had become a rallying cry for anyone who believed in fairness and equality. Back at the police station, Officers Miller and Bates watched news coverage of the protest in stunned silence. Seeing their actions broadcast on television, dissected by commentators and condemned by strangers, left them shaken. For the first time, they began to grasp the magnitude of what they had done and the consequences it might bring. That evening, Chris confided in Ryan, his usual arrogance replaced by vulnerability. "What if we messed up, man?" he asked quietly. "What if we really crossed a line?" Ryan hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally, he shrugged. "I don't know. All I know is we're stuck dealing with whatever comes next." Neither officer slept well that night. Their guilt gnawed at them, a constant reminder of the choices they had made and the price they might soon pay. For Marcus, the day ended with a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. As he walked home alongside Henry, Angela, and Angela's children, he felt a rare moment of peace. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, he truly believed they could make a difference. Together, they had planted seeds of change in Maplewood, and those seeds were beginning to sprout. The days after the second protest marked a turning point in Maplewood. The story of Henry Jackson and the officers' misconduct had spread far beyond the town's borders, drawing attention from regional news outlets and even national media. Reporters descended on Maplewood, eager to capture interviews with Marcus, Henry, and other key figures involved in the growing movement for accountability. For a small town used to minding its own business, the sudden spotlight felt overwhelming, but also necessary. Marcus found himself juggling phone calls, emails, and meetings with journalists, activists, and lawyers offering their support. At first, he worried that the influx of attention might overshadow the core issue, holding Officers Miller and Bates accountable for their actions. But as more people rallied behind the cause, Marcus realized the broader implications of what was happening. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about exposing systemic racism and demanding lasting change. At the police station, Chief Daniels faced mounting pressure from city officials, community leaders, and the public. He had always prided himself on running a tight ship, but now his department was under intense scrutiny. Every decision he made, or failed to make, was dissected and criticized. Frustrated but determined to salvage his reputation, Chief Daniels called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. "We can't keep sweeping this under the rug," he told them bluntly. "The longer we delay, the worse it looks. For us, for the department, and for the town. We need answers, and we need them fast." Reluctantly, Chief Daniels ordered a full internal investigation into the incident involving Henry Jackson. He also announced plans to implement new training programs focused on racial sensitivity and de-escalation tactics. While some officers grumbled about the changes, others privately admitted they were long overdue. For Chris Miller and Ryan Bates, the investigation felt like a personal attack. They attended mandatory interviews with investigators, answering questions about their actions that night. At first, they tried to downplay the severity of what happened, insisting they had acted appropriately given the circumstances. But as evidence mounted, including Lisa Carter's video footage and testimonies from neighbors, their defenses began to crumble. One evening, after another grueling day of questioning, Chris approached Ryan outside the station. Both men looked exhausted, their usual bravado replaced by fear and uncertainty. This is all falling apart, Chris muttered bitterly. No matter what we say, it's not enough. They're going to throw us under the bus. Ryan nodded grimly. Maybe we should just admit we messed up. Apologize or something. At least then we'd have a chance of saving our jobs. Chris hesitated, torn between pride and self-preservation. Finally, he sighed. Fine, let's do it. But I'm not promising anything good will come out of it. The next morning, Chris and Ryan issued a joint statement through the police department. In it, they acknowledged their behavior toward Henry Jackson had been inappropriate and apologized for causing him distress. They claimed they had misunderstood the situation and acted out of frustration rather than malice. Their apology was brief, vague, and lacking genuine remorse, but it was enough to signal a shift in tone. When Marcus read the statement, he wasn't satisfied. To him, it felt like damage control rather than accountability. Still, he recognized it as progress, a small step toward forcing the officers to confront the consequences of their actions. They think saying sorry fixes everything, Marcus said to Angela later that day. But words aren't enough, actions matter, that's why we have to keep pushing. Angela nodded, though she could see the toll the fight was taking on her brother. You're right, she said softly, but don't forget to take care of yourself too. You've already done so much. As the investigation continued, tensions in Maplewood remained high. Some residents praised Marcus and his supporters for shining a light on injustice, while others accused them of dividing the town. Arguments broke out at grocery stores, school board meetings, and even family dinners. The divide ran deep, reflecting years of unspoken grievances and simmering resentment. Despite the backlash, Marcus refused to back down. He organized weekly meetings at the community center, inviting residents to share their thoughts and ideas for moving forward. These gatherings became a space for healing and dialogue, where people could express their frustrations without fear of judgment. Slowly but surely, bridges began to form between neighbors who had once avoided each other. One particularly emotional meeting featured a heartfelt apology from Margaret Ellis, the retired teacher who lived next door to Henry. She stood before the crowd, tears streaming down her face, and admitted she hadn't spoken up sooner because she was afraid of rocking the boat. I let fear silence me, she confessed, and for that I'm truly sorry. But now I know better, and I promise to use my voice to stand up for what's right. Her honesty resonated with many in the room, sparking a wave of similar confessions. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted from anger to hope. People left feeling lighter, as though they had finally begun to address wounds that had festered for too long. In the weeks that followed, Chief Daniels released the findings of the internal investigation. It concluded that Officers Miller and Bates had indeed violated department policies by using excessive force and failing to treat Henry Jackson with respect. As a result, both officers were suspended without pay for 6 months and required to complete additional training on racial bias and ethical policing. While the punishment fell short of what Marcus and his supporters had hoped for, it marked a rare instance of law enforcement holding its own accountable. For many in Maplewood, it was a bittersweet victory, a reminder that progress often comes in small, imperfect steps. With the immediate crisis resolved, Marcus turned his focus to preventing future incidents. Working alongside local activists, he helped establish a civilian oversight board tasked with monitoring police conduct and addressing complaints from the community. The board included representatives from diverse backgrounds, ensuring that marginalized voices would be heard and respected. Henry played a quiet but vital role in these efforts. Though he preferred to stay out of the spotlight, his presence inspired others to keep fighting. Neighbors often stopped by his house to thank him for standing firm despite the humiliation he endured. Each visit reminded Henry that his courage had sparked something bigger than himself, a movement rooted in unity and resilience. Months later, life in Maplewood began to settle into a new rhythm. Conversations about race and justice continued, but they no longer carried the same urgency or hostility. Instead, they reflected a shared commitment to learning and growth. The town wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was trying, and that mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus joined Henry on the porch for their nightly ritual of lemonade and reflection. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. For a long time, neither spoke, content to simply sit together in companionable silence. Finally, Henry broke the quiet. "You know, son," he said softly, "I never imagined any of this would happen when those officers showed up that night. But looking back, maybe it needed to. Maybe we all needed a wake-up call." Marcus smiled, reaching over to pat his father's hand. "You're stronger than you realize, Dad. None of this would have been possible without you." Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't give me too much credit. I just sat there and got soaked. You're the one who turned it into something meaningful." They shared a laugh, the sound mingling with the chirping of crickets in the distance. As darkness fell over Maplewood, Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the progress they had made, but for the bond they had strengthened along the way. Change wouldn't come overnight, and there would undoubtedly be setbacks ahead. But for now, sitting beside his father on the porch, Marcus allowed himself to feel hopeful. Together, they had proven that courage and determination could ignite change. One step, one conversation, and one moment of grace at a time.